Hey folks, so today what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over how I assemble my swords. And I mean, it's a pretty standard thing. The sword is going to be assembled with epoxy and then also have the tang peened over. So I'm just going to go over my process, how I get the sword set up, ready to go. Obviously, you know, you want to make sure everything is nice and finished when you get started. And then since I have multiple pieces coming together, what I've also done is I've gone through and just with a Sharpie made a mark on one side of everything. So that way, as I've got my epoxy mixed up and my timer is counting down on that, I know exactly which side of every piece goes where, because generally when I'm assembling things, you know, things will fit better one way than the other, right? So I just want to make sure that when you go ahead and start assembling everything, and especially when you're peening that tang, it's all going together the right way, because there's nothing worse than doing a final assembly with something put on in reverse and things not lining up the way that they should. So that's what we're going to be going over today, and first thing we're going to do is just kind of take a look at the materials that I have set up in order to do my mixing of the epoxy. So when I'm doing my epoxy, so right now I have a 30-minute epoxy that gives me plenty of time to mess around with stuff as I'm going. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to get that epoxy, I'm going to get it mixed up. I have these little silicone bowls, which are nice because they're reusable. You know, one thing is that I find that there's always so much just throwaway stuff that we use as we're making things, and I try to throw away as few things as possible. So being able to reuse the bowl is nice. I also have a little silicone spatula to use for my mixing and then spreading if I need to. And once I get everything mixed up in here, what I'm going to do is I'll pour it into this syringe here. You can see that it's got a pretty decent aperture. These, I think we got these on maybe on Etsy or something. I'll look into that and find them for you. But if you look up like large syringes, you know, I ended up having to trim this tip to open that aperture a little bit more. But what this does is once I have the epoxy in here, I can just inject into my handle and not have to worry about the mess of like trying to get epoxy on here and then, you know, getting it down in there. That's a pain in the ass. You're trying to pour and everything overflows. Being able to inject the epoxy is a much better way to go. And you can see everything has, you know, I got my Sharpie mark here, even on my little ferrule. I have a Sharpie mark on the inside in case this falls off. I know exactly which way to put it back on. And then, oh yeah, the other thing that I've done is I've just drilled a hole in this block, so that way as I'm getting this set up, I can just have that syringe resting here, so I can just pour into the syringe and then move from there. The other really important part is paste wax, right? So this Johnson's paste wax works great for cleaning up epoxy. You have wet epoxy, you throw this stuff on there, you know, you get a good chunk of the paste wax and you blob it onto where the epoxy is, and it really ends up cleaning up incredibly well, better than you might think. So that all being said, those are what I'm going to use for the assembly, and then we just take a look down, you know, so I have my guard, I have my pommel also marked, and then the handle, and then the side of the tang is also marked. I've prepped my blade by wrapping a section with tape, and this is going to be the section that goes into the vise, and there will also be a piece of leather that goes over to make sure that everything stays you know, nice and finished and doesn't get all messed up during the final assembly here. So that all being said, we're going to just get started with this. All right, so at this point, I'm going to start mixing, or not mixing, but pouring my epoxy in here. And this part of the process isn't terribly exciting, but you know, I figure bring you through it. And you know, I'm not measuring out by weight or anything. I'm basically eyeballing how quickly each, you know, the hardener and the resin are both coming out, and trying to make sure that I'm getting an even amount. You can also, you know, a lot of them will have measurements on the sides, and so you can look and say, all right, well, you know, it seems like we've poured out an even amount or not. And it looks like I had a little bit more of the hardener. All right, so there we go. Now that I got these, so one thing as far as just doing your general epoxy goes is as you're prepping your epoxy bottles and getting them ready to use, you have to trim off the top, and so making sure that you have the same aperture at each end, same size hole at each end, or on each of your bottles is super important to getting an even flow as you're pouring. And so the nice thing about this bowl is that it's not like a Dixie cup where it has a hard corner where either the resin or the hardener can get stuck and stay. So you know, for this is great. You know, you can just scoop it up, spin it, stir it, doing all those things. I'm using 30-minute epoxy, so I'm not super rushed at this point. When I do this kind of assembly where I'm going to be needing to peen stuff and do all of that, I like using something that takes more than 5 minutes, just because it's nice to not really be all that rushed. All right, so now that I have this mixed, I'm just going to go ahead and pour it in here. And these syringes can be reused. I've used this one several times. Basically, just once the epoxy hardens in there, you're able to kind of like squeeze this, break the bond of the epoxy to the syringe itself, and then remove the plunger. So I'm just gonna clean up this drip. Always also very important to have a bunch of paper towels on hand. All right, so we are just about ready to go with this. All right, so now that I have my epoxy in the syringe, you know, I'm looking, I got my dot. Just gonna drop this guy down here. I'm going to use a little bit of epoxy that I have left in here to just kind of paste around this bottom corner. In general, that's all going to get covered up anyway, but you know, you have this extra. Again, this is 30-minute epoxy, so I have not only extra epoxy, but I have a little bit extra time. And so there's no reason not to go ahead and make sure that this, you know, whatever little gap that might be here gets filled, this surface gets covered, and all of that. I mean, there's going to be more cleanup that we're going to be doing once we get the, once we start getting this handle on. And so now, again, I got the syringe, got my handle, and I'm just going to inject this guy with resin. or epoxy as it were. Now what I'm kind of looking for is just, you know, seeing, give it a flip, make sure that we're getting good epoxy through most of this. And it's going to start pouring out. So we got it coming out this side, which is fine. I'm just going to take a look. My dot is on this side. So as I drop this on here, this is going to all start coming out. So I'm just going to, especially because I have a twisted wire handle here, I want to make sure that I'm not getting a huge amount of epoxy in it. So I'm going to clean this up. Oh, and I popped off my little cap here. Again, no big deals. Drop that all down. Clean that up. Put this guy back on. And then the pommel sets on. You can see we got some big drips going on here, so I'm just going to take some of that paste wax we were talking about before and just slather that on here. The paste wax really does an amazing job. So you can see I'm using it liberally, kind of mixing that all up. And now go through and start wiping that off. All right. And for those of you who are asking, yes, this is the Toto sword. Blessing the rains down in Africa. All right, so now I have my ball peen hammer. I'm going to set this tang. You see that I'm not using a huge hammer because we don't need to really, you know, in any scenario you shouldn't really have to be wailing on this in order to get the tang set. So I use the flat to really get things started to expand. And now I'm just using the ball peen to push these corners down. Being very careful because it's very easy to slip and miss and put a big old dent in your pommel. All right, and so now, again, just coming in with this paste wax, going over all these spots. Just giving everything a good wipe down. Making sure everything is aligned and nothing needs to shift. Sometimes there might be a little play in whatever you're putting together, and you want to make sure that you get that all squared away before your epoxy finishes hardening. But you can see how well that paste wax cleans up the cleans up all of that epoxy. I mean, it's remarkable. And that's just about it. You got any big epoxy drips down onto your vise or anything, you can clean that all up. Get epoxy on your hands, you can use the paste wax to help clean that off. And that's it. Hope that helps. And yeah, again, if there's anything else that you guys are interested in learning, if this sparks some other question, let me know, and I will go ahead and make sure that I get a video filmed to help educate you guys on the things that you'd like to be educated on. I hope things are going well in the forge.